we're gonna start with the tattoo fix, HB 2338. And we'll get we're gonna open the hearing on that, and we're gonna get a brief description of what the bill fixes and from Revisor Reimer.
Thank you, Chairman, members of the committee. So this bill pertains to the practice of cosmetology, demonstration permits, and temporary location permits, temporary guest body artist permits, and the criteria that the Board of Cosmetology is used to issue those. The first part of the bill addresses a temporary location permit. It allows the Board of Cosmetology to grant that with certain requirements there on the first page. And then the second page pertains to, again, that temporary location or guest artist permit. Make some changes there. So you can see the requirements there on page 1. Person has to be licensed, or the license has not been revoked, and the license has not been revoked, suspended, or conditioned. Again, pertaining to guest permits and temporary location permits for the Board of Cosmetology.
All right, committee, so you'll recall we passed a bill similar to this a few years ago, or maybe even last year, and the cosmetology didn't read the bill right, and so we're making some fixes to make sure that they do read their bill right going forward. Any questions on for the revisor? Okay, seeing none. We'll go ahead and start with the proponents, and we'll start with Chairman Proctor. Welcome back to Commerce Committee, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
World's biggest commerce fan right there.
There you go. I am a commerce fan. My ears perk up every time you go to the well, sir. Thank you, everybody, for hearing this bill. As the chairman said, a couple years ago, I came to you with a bill to allow for tattoo conventions, essentially. I have a constituent. She came to me. She said, hey, I want to do conventions, but we don't have any mechanism in the state of Kansas that allows people to come from out of state and, for a temporary period of time, do tattooing in the state of Kansas. And so worked with the chairman. He was gracious enough to hear the bill, and we passed a bill that was supposed to allow for temporary locations for conventions and allow for temporary permits. As my constituent tried to wade through the process of actually doing a convention, we discovered, working with the Board of Cosmetology, that there were some concerns with how the bill was written, in that it did not separate the guest permit for the tattoo artist from the location. So the way that the bill was originally written, and I take some responsibility for that, is that the site was licensed for the people, so that everybody who tried to get the guest permit was also going to have to basically sign on to the location, as opposed to the organizer being responsible for getting the location ready, and then each person who wanted to come getting their own guest permit. And so what this bill does is it corrects that problem. It makes it clear in statute that there is a permit for guest artists. They have to be licensed in whatever state they're coming from, and to practice, for them to, on a temporary basis, operate here in Kansas for the convention. And then there's a separate license which must be obtained by somebody who's licensed here in Kansas for a temporary location where the convention will occur and where body art tattooing will be done. And the Board of Cosmetology would have to come in and inspect the site and make sure that it's suitable and safe for Kansans to get tattoos in the facility. So essentially that's what this bill does, is get at the original intent. Could we have possibly done this with regulation? Maybe we could have sorted this out in regulation, but I'm always of the mind that it's better for the legislature to make the legislative intent clear than to rely on regulators and boards and commissions to write laws for us. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'll be happy to stand for questions at the appropriate time.
All right, let's move forward with questions for the Comfrey. Any questions? You did a fairly adequate job of explaining the bill.
I got stunned silence.
So I think you kind of scare them. Thanks, Chairman, for coming in. Next is Brian Parsons. Are you here? Come on down.
Okay. Testimony on House Bill 2338, an act concerning the practice of cosmetology relating to the demonstration permits, authorizing Kansas State Board of Cosmetology to issue temporary location permits and temporary guest body art permits, establishing criteria to issue such permits, amending KSA 2024 65-1958 and repealing the existing section. Chairperson Tarwater and Vice Chair Turk and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to provide testimony in support of HB 2338. The mission of Kansas Board of Cosmetology is to protect the health and safety of the consuming public by licensing qualified individuals and enforcing standards of practice and sanitation. The Board of Cosmetology licensed over 31,000 individuals, practitioners, and instructor trainees and apprentices, and holders of temporary permits in cosmetology, electrology, and aesthetics, nail technology, and body arts. The board licensed approximately 5,000 facilities and schools in those same professions, including tanning. HB 2338 is simply changing terminology in KSA 2024 Sup. 65-1958 to clarify definitions related to the permit. On behalf of the board, I thank you for your time in considering our testimony in support of HB 2338 as we seek to continuously protect the consuming public as well as professionally bringing revenue to Kansas through a trending culture of body art. Sincerely, Brian Parsons.
All right, thank you for that. Committee, is there any questions for Mr. Parsons? All right, seeing none, thank you.
Thanks.
I'm not showing any other oral proponents. Is there anyone else here that wishes to testify as a proponent of this bill? All right, seeing none, we'll move on to neutral, and I don't have any, and I don't have anyone testifying against this bill. Is there anybody here to testify against this bill? All right, seeing none, we'll go ahead and close the hearing on 2338, and we'll probably work this one tomorrow. Thanks for coming in. We're going to open up the hearing on HB 2340 and get a brief description from Revisor Reimer.
Thank you, Chairman, members of the committee. House Bill 2340 provides an exemption for liability for remediation of certain chemicals, specifically pesticidal commercial chemicals. It's specific language that you can find on page 2 of the bill that provides that any person that owns or possesses any interest in property previously owned by the U.S. Army located in Johnson County, they would not be subject to or responsible for restrictions on the use of such land or the costs of investigation, removal, or remediation costs where legally registered pesticidal commercial chemical products were applied by the United States Army at such property prior to 2005. And this provision would apply retroactively. So an exception for liability for some environmental cleanup costs with respect to commercial chemical pesticides for that specific property.
All right, any questions on what the bill does? All right, seeing none, we'll move on to the oral proponents. John Peterson. Welcome to Commerce Committee, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate being here. In my younger days, I spent quite a bit of time in this building. I brought Mr. Federico with me today to make sure I was in the right room at the right time, so I'm pleased to be here. Today, I appear in my capacity as part of the ownership group of the piece of property located in DeSoto, Kansas, historically known as the Sunflower Army Ammunition Plant. Unfortunately, after 20 years of ownership, we've been able to change the name to something more positive, more proactive, hopefully a benefit to the state, and it's named Astra Enterprise Park. I think most have heard that that's the new home for the Panasonic battery plant that's set to open in May of this year. We truly appreciate the opportunity, I do, on behalf of my partners, to speak in support of House Bill 2340. So I know the fundamental question may be, why is this legislation being suggested, put before you for consideration? And I will try to explain that. And I think at the outset, I should explain and maybe acknowledge it's a unique piece of legislation. It's singular in nature. It singularly addresses one piece of property in the state of Kansas. And I would suggest to you the reason for that is that as I get in the next several minutes explaining the factual circumstances before us, the reason it's singular in nature is because the efforts of KDHE over the last 20 years in terms of enforcing a ban on the pesticides we're going to talk about today has been singular, only at sunflower, even though these chemicals have been used throughout the state of Kansas previously. To use a legal term, I'm a retired lawyer, so I'm a recovering lawyer, so I try not to use legal terms unless I have to. It's arbitrary and capricious. I think the more common way to explain it, it's a solution looking for a problem. And we have to bear, to date, the burden of that. So a little bit of background. As I indicated, been used to create munitions since the 1940s. I think everybody's familiar with the history of sunflower. 9,000 acres of property. I'm from Johnson County, so I use this example. It's almost exactly the size of Leawood, Kansas. It's a big piece of property, 6 miles north to south, 4 miles east to west. A lot to address when you're turning it from a former Army munitions plant to something more productive, as I indicated, but also presents a great deal of opportunity. To consummate this transaction back 20 years ago, it took special legislation from Senator Pat Roberts to allow a private entity to acquire fee title to this property in a contaminated condition. It was very unique. It was a multi-party transaction. We had to sit down at a table with the United States Army, the EPA, the state of Kansas, Johnson County, KDHE, and all try to figure out what will be the rules of engagement moving forward if you want to own this property, working with the Army, working with all those regulators to be sure we get this property put back in a productive state. And the basic deal, in very broad brush, the basic deal that came out of all those conversations and agreements was that the Army would remain responsible for anything in the soil, That's their responsibility under federal law, under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which everybody refers to as RCRA, or anything in the groundwater. And SRL, as you're working with the Army, you'll be responsible for all the other stuff the Army left on 9,000 acres. And you can imagine they left a lot of stuff. Buildings, piles of concrete, all the other kind of things that you would see in that type of operation. That was the basic deal, and we all worked together, and we worked with KDHE. Being a proponent of this bill is not meant to be an indictment of KDHE. In this specific case that I'm going to speak to, I think it's an overreach of KDHE, but they have kept their shoulder to the wheel as we have to try to move this project forward, and we've appreciated working with them. The good news, we've witnessed in this collective effort over $200 million being spent at Sunflower. And I know, Mr. Chairman, you have visited the site. Beyond just a 4 million square foot building that'll produce 4,000 jobs, coming out of what was something nobody wanted to talk about for many, many years. We've got infrastructure, we're extending sewers, we're building SRL, Sunflower Redevelopment, building new roads, things are going well. But we're getting down to an issue that we addressed with KDHE from day one, and honestly, all of us kept kicking the can. And the issue was one component of pesticides. And let me try to tell you describe exactly what the problem is. When we bought the property, there were over 700, maybe close to 800 different buildings on this site. 800. There's about 540 left today. Most of them are wood. Now, the issue is not any of the production chemicals or residues or contaminants that came out of making munitions. The issue today was born by the fact that they had wooden buildings under the control of the Army. And guess what? We all know what likes wooden buildings: termites. And so the Army would regularly treat their wooden buildings for termites, the common usage of pesticides. And they did so, this particular type of pesticide, up until 1988, 37 years ago. That's the last time the subject of today's testimony was used. We've never applied pesticide, the Army did. So when we sat down and struck our deal and soon learned that KDHE was going to take the position, those pesticides that were used around those buildings, they have to be remediated as well. Army, it's in the soil. Army said, no, we're not going to do it because there is a federal exemption for this exact pesticide, type of pesticide. RCRA, which controls the cleanup of this type of facility in which we operate, which we have to satisfy to get a no further action letter from KDHE, this type of activity is specifically exempted under federal law. And thus when we say arbitrary and capricious, we stand here today and say there's a federal law that says they're exempt. KDHE moves forward to say to us, no, I know the Army won't do it. You have to do it. But there's no state statute that speaks to this issue. If there's no state statute, we know there's no regulation that was appropriately promulgated based on a state statute. And thus it was born 20 years ago, an idea, an opinion, a preference by KDHE to require us to do this. So when you're faced with this, of course, we want to say, we don't want to spend and we've just updated our estimates to address this pesticide issue around these buildings, which we calculate to be approximately a $20 million expenditure. We have about $90 million of work still to be done in building demolition and the like at Sunflower. Almost 20 million of it is digging up the dirt. This is how dangerous it is. Digging up the dirt, putting it in a dump truck and taking it to the landfill in Shawnee, Kansas. But it's $20 million. Remember, it's 9,000 acres, 540 buildings. But as owners of property, we did not just take the position, we're federally exempt, the Army won't do it, we don't want to do it, we don't care if there's a risk. We wanted to know, is there a risk? We promised to be good stewards of this property. I think we've lived up to that commitment that we made 20 years ago. We wanted to be sure that businesses that had employees out there, that this was going to be a safe environment based on the risk level. Everything has risks, but that the risk tolerance level that this has historically been used by Kansas would be adhered to. So we went and got the expert, and the expert is Dr. Kanan Patel. She provided written testimony. I hope you take the time to read it. And we did a very thorough human health and risk assessment of these specific elements. Given how they were used at Sunflower, what would occur once development occurs and the sites are all graded, and even where the exact spots pesticide were used, which are spread out over acres and acres. And she concluded, and again, she's the leading expert in this regard for Burns and McDonald, based in Kansas City, that does this kind of work for military facilities all over the United States, concluded that well within risk tolerance for the industrial type uses we're anticipating. I know KDHE is always worried, but what if someday there's a residential use out there? We're building an industrial park, Panasonic, things, advanced manufacturing, but we still meet acceptable standards even if there was going to be residential. So that's where we are today, and I would say, I think there may be an answer why in the risk analysis that's done, the real level of concern, remember a solution looking for a problem, in the fact that it's a selective enforcement at Sunflower. I can take an example in my Johnson County neighborhood of Northeast Johnson County, and many I think on the committee are from Johnson County. And you only have to drive through the cities of Leawood, Mission Hills, Prairie Village to see hundreds of homes built back in the 40s and the 50s that are torn down and newer and bigger homes put on the exact same lots, sometimes the exact same foundations. Those houses were using the same chemical prior to 1988 for pesticides were used at Sunflower. If it's that dangerous, why hasn't there been a bill proposed to control this statewide? Maybe the most glaring example is right across the street from us in DeSoto, Kansas, is a residential community called Clearview City. It was Army-built residential units for their employees. It was sold to a third party before we bought the remainder of Sunflower. Clearly, the exact same pesticides were used to control termites at that facility, and there's people living in those units today, and there's redevelopment going on this exact soil that they stand on. And I think maybe that's one of the clearest indications that, save for the fact that the department has us, we can't get a no further action letter. Somebody decided they should have to clean them up even though nobody else is, and we've lived with that over the last 20 years. I will close with this. It does have a true effect on our efforts at economic development. The cost, I've already identified that. That may be enough. But of late, we have an opportunity with advanced manufacturing companies that are shown extreme interest. We're in conversations to take Panasonic and bring a real return to the state of Kansas for the investment it made in that project. We have a real opportunity, but many of them, because of the industry they're in, want to take advantage of the Inflation Reduction Act. And the Inflation Reduction Act gives an additional 10% federal tax credit to certain qualifying companies that locate within a site like ours that has been rehabilitated. This pesticide issue is stopping us from being able to qualify because of KDHE's position under that act. It is a real economic negative impact on the project. So, Mr. Chairman, I hope I at least tried to give an idea of what this is all about. I would close. We don't come and support a bill like this lightly. It's to get legislation passed is serious business, and it should be taken seriously and should be evaluated. Don't like necessarily publicly disagreeing with KDHE because we've been able to work out other situations where we've initially had a different interpretation or a disagreement. But this one, we can't. Now we've learned that they want us to start tracking pesticides in the water, the groundwater. We have a prohibition. We set aside pesticides. We have a prohibition. We won't use the groundwater out there at all. And again, that's an Army responsibility. So it doesn't look like we're going to be able to get this one resolved. And we think it is appropriate and reasonable under the circumstances to seek a legislative solution for this problem. Appreciate your time and be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. I think you did it. I think you have explained it quite well. We talk about overregulation in this room quite a bit, and the fact that you're being overregulated and no one else has to follow the same rule is a little odd. I mean, we'll just leave it at that, and we'll talk to KDHE on why they've chosen to take that road. We do have a couple of questions for you. Representative King.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Peterson, good to see you.
Thank you.
This isn't the first administration that has worked on this issue out at Sunflower, is it? And
No, sir. In fact, to show you how much time it has taken to get us on the precipice of we've had success, real success. For us to buy this property under Senator Roberts' legislation, we had to get permission first from the governor of the state of Kansas, and that governor was Kathleen Sebelius.
Yeah. So, Mr. Chair, so in one of my previous roles, I helped this development. I did go to Washington, D.C., meet with the Department of the Army, and it was clearly the understanding that the only regulatory aspect of this would be the Department of the Army and not state jurisdiction over the groundwater and the land itself. So just want to make clear that this has been going on for 10 years, and we did get a confirmation from the Department of the Army on that a decade ago. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Clayton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here today. Strong supporter of economic development, especially on this site. I want to be able to support this legislation. Sorry, it's hard to actually make eye contact with you given where I'm sitting, so thank you for, because I do want to see why I'm talking to you. But so I do have a couple of concerns here. And number one, I know a lot of this will be for industrial, right? Industrial development, which I support because it's not like during industrial development, people are going to be going outside and rolling around in the dirt, that sort of thing. But can you tell me how much will be residential out of this? So, because to me, there's a difference between putting an industrial development at Sunflower and then residential where people are going to be living, you know, kids, pets. So can you tell me a little bit more about how that looks?
Even I can come up with a very succinct, quick answer: zero.
So no residential?
We have no residential master planned into our, I think the concern that I've heard is, well, 40 years from now, the plant may want us close and sell, and somebody wants to come in and build residential at that point. I think if you look at Dr. Patel's study, you'll see that once development occurs the first time, you are so for allowing the standard risk analysis level, you wouldn't have a concern. But I think the likelihood of that is, and of course, the response to that is, well, in 40 years, if somebody picks a site, and I feel like I'm making something up to at least answer your question. I think it's so unlikely. I decided I want to build, it'd probably be an apartment building. It wouldn't be a single-family subdivision. On this 50 acres, well, there'll be a KDHE at the time and say, well, we had this concern. You've got to show us that that 40 acres is there. One thing to remember, and again, I don't want to belabor by answering a succinct question, is this isn't 540 buildings. This isn't building next to building, next to building, next to, it's a building here, it's a building over there, it's 2 or 3 buildings here, it's 4 or 5 buildings here. And so it's not like there's even a concentration of this. What we did in our study to make sure, and this was Dr. Patel's direction to us, she said, go find the 10 acres with the most buildings closest together, because remember, you just spray the pesticides around the foundation. I wanted the closest you can find out there. And her study, if you would look at her testimony, and I'd be happy to provide the entire text of the analysis, came up with her findings that it was suitable. But we have no plans for residential. The residential, fortunately, is popping up on all the ground around our sides in the city of DeSoto. There's more apartments under planning and construction out there to support the workforce everybody anticipates coming, but not on our side.
That is helpful to know. And will I find, because I just got, when we walked in, just got the testimony for Dr. Patel's study, so I have not fully read Dr. Patel's testimony, but you talked about how that those pesticides were used in Northeast Johnson County, and obviously it's been residential there for quite some time. Do we know if the proportions were similar as to what was used there and what was used on the Army site?
I don't know that.
Right.
It is the RCRA exemption speaks to as commonly used, and there were common uses back in the 40s and the 50s and prior to 1988, which is when these were not used anymore. And but I don't think there's been any inquiry by us what happened in other sites across Kansas, but I don't think there has been by KDHE either.
All right, and so again, so it's all just intended industrial. That's the really important thing that I need to know. So just wanted to reiterate that. Thank you so much for being here today. I appreciate your testimony.
Thank you.
Did you have another follow-up, or was that it?
Nope, that was
Okay,
it.
all right. Representative Corbett.
Thank you, Chairman. As you've been talking about, probably throughout the last 50 years through the entire United States, if somebody found something that worked and it was approved by the government for termites or whatever it was used throughout the country. Then at one time, and that product was taken off the shelves. And I can tell you, I can't remember the name of it, but every contractor I knew tried to get as much of it as they could because it worked. And it's just not where you're at. I mean, any place you have any construction or termites in the United States, that's down there somewhere. So it's just there.
And it's not just, it's farm fields, it's barns, I mean, you're absolutely correct, Mr. Representative.
Representative Wilcott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we've heard through some of the statements and testimony that you provided that the particular property has been kind of singled out for this, where the U.S. Army has previously said, from a former colleague of mine, made the statements that the Army had agreed to clean up basically all the issues at the time. The Army's statement is that this isn't an issue, shouldn't be an issue. It sounds like there's a pretty good overreach from KDHE in this area where they're going above and beyond. Would it be crazy to say that this should be more of a statewide setting versus a one specific location? If it truly is an overreach on a specific issue, whether it be in an industrial or a specific pesticide, should we make this a standard statewide if it's not really an issue?
I got enough to do dealing with 9,000 acres at Sunflower. I'm not trying to render an opinion about the rest of the state. What I can say is, to the best of my knowledge, sometimes legislation has to cure a problem. And the only place that it's manifested itself as a concern where people may be in a position to argue over regulation or regulation without statutory authority is Sunflower. Now, there is one exception. I've heard possibly at Parsons, the Army ammunition plant, and possibly Fort Leavenworth, because again, it's the Army and KDHE, but I know here is where we have been told you are not going to get a no further action letter unless you do something nobody else is doing across the state. So speaking to, if nobody else has the issue, maybe it's better to leave it alone, I would guess. We support the bill and we support it and understand again the unique character that it only applies to our property, but that's where the problem lies.
All right, committee, any other questions? I just have one or two maybe. So how long have you owned this property?
This year be 20 years.
Right, so 20 years, you made an investment 20 years ago, and it's finally got to the point to where we're building some huge monstrous structure out there. And now you've got all the suppliers wanting to build out there with no incentives, by the way, right? And this is standing in the way.
It's a big inhibitor. Got it.
All right, for those of you that have not had the opportunity to tour that area, the entire area, not just the Panasonic building, I would contact this gentleman here, and he'll take you out there anytime you want. And it's really neat to see the progress. I'm not seeing any questions for you, sir, so we're done.
Thank you for your time.
All right. I'm not showing another oral opponent or proponent. There is a written proponent. Is there anyone else here that testify as a proponent on this bill? Mr. Federico, you want to take a stab at it? I mean, you graced us with your presence today. I got a call on you. All right, I'll close the proponent and open the opponent. And KDHE is here, I believe, as an opponent to this bill. Please state your name and for the record, and go ahead with your testimony, sir.
Is it on now? All right. Good afternoon, Chairman Tarwater and committee members. My name is Leo Henning. I'm the Deputy Secretary and Director of Environment at the Kansas Department of Health and Environment. KDHE is opposed to House Bill 2340. And I have provided written testimony, and I do hope that you read it prior to working this bill. What I want the committee is to understand some of the background at this facility, and I will say Mr. Peterson did a fairly good job at talking about the background of this facility. But again, the Sunflower Ammunition Plant was built for the World War II effort to produce explosives and rocket propellant. It manufactured nitrocellulose, nitroguanidine, and nitroglycerin. Those were the products that it sent out of the facility. And the production at the plant was shut down sometime during the Vietnam War time framing. The facility was issued a RCRA, and you've heard RCRA used several times here. It is a federal law permit from the Environmental Protection Agency in 1991. That permit was issued because the facility used and stored large amounts of hazardous waste, and there were numerous sites that were contaminated and needed cleaned up. The Army uses that RCRA permit to do the cleanup at that site. It's that permit which drives the cleanup of that facility, is that RCRA permit. And there are 120 different contaminated sites at this facility. So it's a big site. In 2005, Sunflower Redevelopment made a deal with the Army to take over ownership and an important part here, and cleanup operations at the site, and assumed all the environmental liability. At that time, as part of the agreement, Sunflower entered into a consent agreement with KDHE. In that consent agreement, they specifically agreed to clean up asbestos, contaminated soil for the pesticides, and what was it, and lead-based paint. So, in that agreement, which is the agreement that the governor used at that time to agree to make the deal to allow the transfer to occur, was that those three contaminants were being addressed. Also, SRL received the 9,000 acres that you've heard about in Johnson County. They also received $109 million from the Army to clean up the site. So that was part of the deal. The Army gave them $109 million to clean it up. And plus they received 2 environmental insurance policies to cover them in case there was a cost overrun or for unknowns. After taking the cleanup activities at the site, it became apparent that SRL, the cleanup cost was going to far exceed the $109 million that they received from the Army. So the Army had to return to the site and continue the cleanup efforts, but SRL still remained the property owner. KDHE and SRL agreed to a standard remedy for pesticides in 2010. And for a while, SRL was cleaning up the pesticides until funding became difficult for them. SRL made an insurance claim on those insurance policies in 2018 to address the pesticides. SRL received $24 million from the insurance company to address pesticides. Now, House Bill 2340 has been introduced, which now relieves them from cleaning up the pesticides. So a little bit about the pesticides, so you know what we're talking about. The 4 pesticides that are commonly applied at the facility is called dieldrin, aldrin, heptachlor, and chloridane. These are highly toxic chemicals that have been banned in the United States from being applied since the 1980s. These chemicals are neurotoxins and are probable carcinogens. These chemicals, the concentrations that we are seeing at the facility are many times higher than what the residential standards for these chemicals are. Some of the chemicals have reached up to 800 times the residential standards for these pesticides. Some of them are 50 to 100, some are less than that, but we're talking about highly contaminated soils. KDHE mission, this is why we're here, is protect the citizens' health from hazardous chemicals like the ones that I just mentioned. KDHE could not allow soils of these concentrations to remain in residential sites. Residential standards means that the soil is clean and there's no ill effect from encountering these soils. Residential areas include activities around buildings for childcare, schools, playgrounds, parks, and residential homes. KDHE is also concerned that this bill prohibits institutional controls, which is that long-time instrument to allow future generations, landowners, to know that there were these pesticides applied and that they are still there. New landowners or developers in the future could buy and develop an area with these chemicals and inadvertently spread the contaminated soil to allow human contact and terrible health outcomes, leading to residential concerns about their health, future lawsuits, and questions about how well sunflower is actually ever cleaned up. If they find these contaminants in their backyard, they're going to start asking, well, how well did KDHE do really cleaning up this site, or making sure that it was cleaned up to the right amounts? It's just, so I would also say this bill sets up an unprecedented policy. It allows other entities and other contaminants to introduce bills that relieves them from cleaning up their sites. Kansas has always wanted entities that caused the contamination or took responsibility for cleaning up that contamination to complete those activities. It has always been in this state the mantra of, if you're a polluter, you should pay to clean up your mess. This bill will not allow KDHE to provide oversight for cleaning up the contamination at this facility. It relieves SRL from fulfilling its promises to clean up the facility, but puts future landowners, developers, and residents in risk. Now, all my testimony so far has been based upon, one, addressing these pesticides, but this bill also puts the entire cleanup process for the site in limbo. If KDHE does not provide this authority to fulfill its mission and make sure that the site is cleaned up, EPA will likely take the lead on this site. The federal cleanup process would be much more onerous and much more slower than the current state-led process. So this bill really doesn't accomplish what it was proposed to do. So I know that we just heard from Mr. Peterson that he says that there will be no residential properties in this site. Yet the bill specifically says that there will be no institutional controls placed on that property. Those institutional controls, I think, is what the concern is. If there is an institutional control that notifies future landowners that there are pesticides out here and that they need to be remediated before the property is used for other than industrial standards, KDHE is fine with that. We have told SRL numerous times, if this is non-residential, meaning industrial, you don't have to clean up the pesticides. They have not agreed, nor will they agree to put the institutional controls to let future landowners and subdivisions of this property to know about that contamination. So SRL brings the point that we are singling them out and we're treating them differently. That is absolutely untrue. Any facility that has a RCRA permit is looked at and reviewed by KDHE to ensure that if that property is going to be residential, that pesticides are dealt with. We have over 350 federal sites that we provide oversight in this state for. Every one of them, we would do the same process. So although they may feel like they're being picked on, they obviously are not. So he did talk about the risk assessment. When KDHE questioned the methodology used behind that risk assessment and how the determination that there was not a risk there, it was pretty quickly disbanded as being a good report. And I will go into that more in detail if you want to have the discussion about it. But in the sampling and the way that they selected the sampling sites to use to make that risk assessment, it was highly skewed to show that there'd be no risk at this facility. When we brought this to their attention, the whole risk assessment went away. So like I said, we are good with the industrial zoning. If they will put this property with the city that says that this is non-residential, industrial only, this whole issue will end right here and now. They will not do that. The reason that we don't go to every home in Kansas City to see if they use these pesticides is because RCRA does not apply to residential properties. It only applies to hazardous waste sites. The reason that we don't go into homes and say, oh, there's these pesticides here and you have to dig them out. As long as the pesticides are applied and are still being used for the intended purposes, so if all those 500 wooden structures were still out there and still being used, the pesticides can stay there. As long as they are there and performing what they were applied for is still there, they can remain. It's only when you tear those buildings out and now we have contaminated soil there above standards that then the pesticides need to be addressed. So for the Army part of this, the Army will not sell property for residential standards when there is pesticides left. They will only clean up to industrial standards. That's why a lot of these federal facilities are still federal facilities, because they will only clean them up to industrial standards. If you want to go residential, there has to be an intermediate person, like an SRL, that takes it from that industrial cleanup to a residential standard. So I think that concludes most of my comments. I will leave you with a scenario if you don't mind. And like I want to reiterate, if we make this a commercial or industrial area, these issues go away. It's only when we do not have any controls of that going into the future and potential residential. This has all been shared with SRL in the past. If it is a residential property and these soils start being moved around, we're going from a known situation, we know exactly where these pesticide soils are, and we allow homes to be built on quarter or half acre lots, swimming pools are built, basements are dug, these soils get spread out all over. We do not anymore know where they are. And so therefore the amount of testing that would be required in the future will only go up, because now we don't know where they are. They were exactly right here. Now, without controls, they could be anywhere after soil starts getting moved around. So that's our concern. So with that, I highly recommend that this bill not be approved, and I will stand for your questions.
Committee, any questions? Representative Clayton?
So my question here is, and again, I'm sorry, it's tough to make eye contact where I'm at. No, don't worry about it, staff, like you're fine. So my question here is will the state be on the hook for any cleanup money? Because again, I want to make sure that we are working things out for all involved. I want good economic development. I want to make sure that citizens are safe, and I want to make sure we're not blowing up the budget. Talk to me a little bit more about what that looks like.
Well, the way the bill is currently written, KDHU would not have any involvement in this property forever. So if a developer 40 years from now decides to buy the property, subdivide it into residential, they would have to go to EPA to get the oversight if they even know that the soil is still contaminated. Someone's going to have to tell that new owner, hey, there are still pesticides here. It won't be us. They'll be off the RCRA permit. So who's going to do that? Without the institutional controls that I'm talking about, we will lose all the information that would be available for future landowners and property owners to know that there's even a situation there.
But basically, this bill as it stands, because I see no fiscal note on the S drive, but I really just want to make sure we're not costing the state any extra money here. Because again, we are all very conscientious of the budget here. We're kind of working through that process and just want to make sure, will this cost the state money if this passes?
It will, for the oversight of the cleanup, it will not cost anything. What it will cost us in the future, and I'll go down this scenario, is if there's no controls, this happens, as I explained in this scenario, these properties get broken up, soil starts getting moved around. homes start getting built in this area because no one knows what's going to happen in 40, 50, 100 years from now. If those things start happening and someone starts testing their soil after their house has been built and finds out that there are high levels of these toxins in their backyard, who is going to pay for it? Everyone in this room is going to be gone, but we're going to have high levels of toxic material in their backyard. If you're that property owner, who are you going to go after? Who are you going to ask to clean this up? Especially when we had someone that has agreed to clean it up.
Representative Shu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Leo, for being here. I'm sure this is like 20 years of back and forth, and the history was nice, but we're all absorbing it all at once. From where I'm standing, it doesn't seem like the solution is that far apart, right? If they maintain that they are only ever going to be industrial commercial, if you maintain industrial commercial is fine at current levels, that seems like we should be okay. And then so as long as that remains to be true, I don't see why this bill is necessary unless they do plan on doing residential at some point, in which case I think I agree. I would like to adjust the language a little bit to allow for that, if you want to respond to that.
Yes, this could all go away if there was an agreement to put institutional controls on that say there are contaminated soils here. In the future, if this is used for anything other than industrial, then someone needs to address the contamination that is still left.
Representative Wilcott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to ask you the similar question to what I asked beforehand, and I'm actually going to play off my former colleague's statement here. So sounds like industrial and commercial is the KDHE doesn't have an issue with that. True. Would KDHE go on the record and say they don't have an issue with that statewide?
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Okay, that's all I needed. Right. Thank you.
I would say where we run into troubles with any industrial site is when you try to take it from an industrial standard to a residential standard.
Okay, sir. So what is this property zoned for?
What's it selling for?
What is it zoned for? Is it zoned for commercial or is it zoned for homeowners?
Right now, it is, I don't think it's zoned anything by the city of DeSoto. It might be industrial, but I am not sure on that. But there's no control. That's the problem. You can move from one to another within a city very easily.
And the chemicals, you've mentioned several chemicals in your testimony, but the only one this applies to is the chemical for termites, correct?
Right. There are 4 pesticides that the Army used out here, or at the Sunflower site: chloridane, dealdrin, aldrin, and heptachlor.
Okay.
The number of contaminations chemicals at this facility are many, but we are just talking about pesticides right now.
Right. And so all the rest of it will be remediated by the Army if it's developed. That's right, right?
Right. The Army has addressed everything out here to date.
Okay, so it's all gone except for the pesticides.
Right, because they will clean them pesticides up to an industrial standard. They will not clean them up to a residential standard. The reason the Army does that is because of the fiscal impact it would have on them. If you look at all their military installations around the United States, they will not do it. And this issue is not a new issue. This is an issue that has been bannered between the US EPA and DOD for 40 years. Unfortunately, we are here to protect human health and the environment.
In your testimony, you said that that they had an agreement that they signed with you to clean up asbestos and what else? This is Ad Astra,
First,
right?
they agreed to, when they signed the consent order, where the consent order said that you will deal with the contaminants that are left that the Army will not. And those were lead-based paint, asbestos, and the pesticides. That was agreed to back when this property first transferred in 2005. Matter of fact, Governor Sebelius said, are we happy that all these things that we've been fighting with the Army about are now taken care of? I'm not signing this deal unless they're taken care of. And we said, yes, we have an agreement with the new developer that these things will be taken care of. And then on top of that, they went and received $24 million from their insurance company to deal with these pesticides. To date, I don't think any of that money has been spent on pesticides.
How did they get approved to build Panasonic?
Panasonic will not purchase the property as industrial, because that's what it is. And two, for the committee's sake, they wouldn't buy that property unless it met residential standards. They did not want to buy a contaminated property. So the property that Panasonic is sitting on has been cleaned up to residential standards, because no company is going to buy a piece of property where it's got lingering contamination on it.
I thought you just said they didn't spend a dime of their $24 million to clean up the property, but evidently they did on that section.
That area, which is a small part of the entire area, was cleaned up to residential standards, mostly, if not totally, by the Army. Even though the Army says that they will not clean it up.
To your knowledge, you said, they had never spent a dime of that money to clean up the property. This contradicts that. What else in your testimony isn't all the way truthful? Can you get me a copy of this agreement by tomorrow? We're working this bill tomorrow. I want that agreement that says that they're going to clean up all this stuff.
I sure can.
Where did these chemicals come from? Could you buy them in the store, or did they have to come through an exterminator? Or how did it work back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s?
In the 40s, these were readily available chemicals.
And when somebody tears down a house and rebuilds a house, you don't require them to do this same remediation.
Because those homes are not under a RCRA permit. RCRA
so does that
only
make it not? Does that make it safe because this RCRA permit wasn't there? It's safe for somebody to tear down a house that has the same chemicals on it, but it's not safe to build a factory on?
There's no legal nexus for us to be involved in homes. RCRA, the federal law, only applies to RCRA facilities or hazardous waste facilities.
Well, then who's letting all these people die?
Hmm?
I mean, who's letting all this stuff happen? If we're allowing this to happen, how is it happening? Only because you're not allowed to go there?
Right. You have to have authority for the environmental agencies to be involved. We have no authority in residential homes. I don't think anyone in this group wants us involved in private homes.
Not if you're going to act like this. No. You said that you have proof that the chemicals are 800 times stronger than any homeowner. If you don't have access to homes, how do you know?
The residential standards is what I said.
Oh,
There's a residential standard that is allowed, and the contamination we find in a couple of these schmooze are 800 times that amount. I won't say that every place is 800 times, but that's the highest it is. Most of the time, they're 50 to 100 times over the residential standard.
Can you get that to the committee as well? Representative Sutton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Kind of playing off some of that, I want to make sure I'm understanding this correctly, though. The buildings are uninhabited, and that's why you can be searching the soil and checking on the content of the soil and such. But if these houses were being utilized right now, that would be the levels of pesticide that are currently there are just fine. Is that right? What am I missing here?
As long as the pesticides are still being used for their intended purposes, which is a termicide, then there's no requirement to dig them up or change or clean them up. It is only when that building is no longer there. And as was testified, there's 500 or so of these buildings out here where they are dilapidated, gone, been burnt, whatever, that now that building can't be there, the pesticides for that building are not serving a purpose anymore. So therefore, our concern is that as those soils are moved around, they could come in contact with humans.
All right. That's actually kind of where I was going with that. So if there were people living there when it would certainly come in contact with people, and people were living there and digging their swimming pools and renovating their yards, where the earth would certainly be moved around, that's okay. But when it's abandoned, now we have a problem. When it isn't coming in contact with people, or could potentially someday come in contact with people again. Am I understanding this correctly?
You are, and it has to be with our authority. We have no authority in residential homes. We only have authority as we are allowed, and that authority is applied to the hazardous waste sites or RCRA facilities.
All right. Now, if I could just continue a little bit here. The chemicals we're talking about here, they haven't been used in, 40 some odd years, maybe even significantly longer than that. Is there a half-life on this, or are these immortal chemicals? Are these the only immortal termite drugs that have ever been invented? Is this true?
They are good. They were good pesticides, okay? They did their job. You're right, they were applied in the 40s, and here we are 80 years later and still finding them active and at these higher concentrations. They last a long time, which is one of the reasons that they were banned in the United States, is they are very toxic.
Because they last.
And they last forever.
That makes sense. Sure, why not? These work. Stop it immediately. All right, so, okay, so I'm assuming it's some sort of an oil base. So how is it that this can be the only substance that lasts and doesn't wash away and doesn't absorb into the soil and doesn't break down in sunlight? How is it that, what is this stuff?
Well, it's highly chlorinated chemicals.
So is my pool. That doesn't, it changes. It doesn't work.
It's the chlorine that's on this chemical that really causes bacteria not to want to try to eat it. It's kind of like when you put chlorine in your pool. It kills bacteria, right? It kills termites.
It doesn't last 80 years.
Yeah, but it also aerates. Where this stuff is a solution, it likes being where it is. There's just no real reason for it to deteriorate. But it was a very good pesticide.
Apparently.
Does it last forever?
All right. Thank you.
Representative Penn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That was quite an amazing line of questioning, and I appreciate my colleague for that. Kind of on topic, but off topic, it kind of struck my mind. You're with KDHE, is that correct?
Yes, correct.
So down in Wichita, we have a spill that happened under 29th and Grove. TCE is that chemical down there, and you guys, you said that, yeah, there we go. So you guys said that that you're not responsible for it if it's residential, but you are responsible for it if it's abandoned. Is that correct?
Now, this is a different chemical because TCE is a volatile organic compound. It was spilt by Union Pacific in the rail yard and migrated from the rail yard in groundwater through and into a residential area. And Union Pacific is the responsible party for that spill. KDHE provides oversight to UP to make sure that it gets cleaned up.
Tracking. And what does that oversight look like? Have those, what you're talking about here today, there are notices that you perform or present to residents or tenants that would be, or buyers for that property, that these chemicals are in the ground and it's a hazard and it lasts forever, it's completely insoluble, and it should probably be in Congress or something like that. So I guess the question is, when it comes to that deal down there, do you provide those same types of notices to those residents in that spilled area?
So in that area, we worked with Sedgwick County and Wichita to make sure that, one, vapor barriers were put on basements or below basements that were being
How often
constructed.
did you do that? When did that spill occur?
I believe that spill occurred way back in the 60s.
Actually, it was in the late, early 80s, if you will, but go ahead.
And then, well, I think the spill occurred in the 60s. The site wasn't discovered until the 80s.
Right. And what was your remedy at that time?
Remedy is to dig up the contaminated soil and then put most of the contamination in that site is groundwater. And so removing the highly contaminated water, contaminants in the water at the source area. And right now we are looking at, Union Pacific has been approved to put in the down gradient, because I believe that plume is almost a mile and a half long, to start treating the groundwater along the plume, the length of the plume.
And Mr. Chairman, just so you understand, my line of questioning is kind of on topic but off topic, and since we have KDHE representatives
try to
here today.
stick to the
Gotcha,
subject
sir.
at hand.
The question that I have, it goes back to what we're talking about when we're discussing what is your authority chain and line, what type of land is it on when you have a chemical that's in the ground, and whether or not KDHE has actually performed in this piece with us in Wichita as a representative from Wichita, whether or not you all have done what you're supposed to, not UP, but KDHE,
Right.
giving out these notices to the constituents, and you haven't. That's already out there. And whether or not that's the same type of thing that we're dealing with here, with some of the inaccuracies and ineffectualities that you're presenting today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So earlier you had said, sir, that as long as they weren't building homes, you would be fine with this. Why then can they not build warehouses currently on that land? Why is KDHE standing in the way of that, or are you? It's okay, they can go ahead and move forward with any development that is not a home?
Yeah, if they'll put a control on the property that says you can build a warehouse, and in 50 years, someone decides to tear that warehouse down and put a house there, or a residential area, that new owner knows that the pesticides weren't dealt with, that warehouse can be built tomorrow.
All right. You had said also that this Burns and McDonald study that was done was, in your opinion, done in the easiest areas where it would have it'd be beneficial to the landowner. And then when you brought that up, this study went away. That's what you said, right?
So they picked a study area where there are many sites or contaminated pesticide facilities. And so they picked a good location on the facility to do it. What they did was, when they actually took the soil samples to see what the average concentrations were, those soil samples were laid out in such a manner that many of them were going to, without a doubt, be clean. And when you take a lot of clean samples and mix it with a few that they did find contamination, when you look at the average over that whole site, then all of a sudden it looks like it's a clean piece of property, and it's not.
All right, so you said the study went away, but the document I have is dated February 11th, 2025. I would say it's still here. And it also states that it was a worst-case scenario and that they did the study as a worst-case scenario. And so your opinion is one, their opinion is another.
The document is still out there, yes. It's still in our file. But as we have discussed it amongst SRL and Burns and Mac, that document and its findings was found to be flawed.
Okay, committee, anything else? All right, seeing no more questions for you, sir. Thanks for coming in today. I don't see any other opponents. Is there anyone else here that wants to testify against this bill? All right, committee, I'll draw your attention to also, there are a couple of written proponents. The City of DeSoto and AFP are also proponents of this bill, and we will be working this bill tomorrow. I'll close the hearing on this bill. All right, we have 10 minutes left, so we're going to try to work a couple of bills to get them out of the way. For those of you that are here to talk about 2119, we are not working that today. We'll probably be working that tomorrow. Okay, I'll draw your attention to HB 2304, and with a description on what this is a transparency bill. Charles Reimer.
Thank you, Chairman, members of the committee. So the committee will recall that HB 2304 makes a number of changes to the database that is required to be on the Department of Commerce's website by current law, and that's what this bill does.
All right, any questions on what the bill does? Seeing none, for discussion, I know that I'm aware of a couple amendments. Any Representative Williams?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Charles, if you will pass out our balloon amendment. As he's passing out the balloon amendment, we did identify one section that will need a technical adjustment. We do have the language for it. It is pretty straightforward, and I'll be able to explain that technical adjustment. And once you have your balloon amendment in hand, I'll walk you through the changes. The first change, once you grab your amendment, will be on page 3. As you recall, this has been a process of working through updates with the transparency database, and appreciate the 5 years of progress the Department of Commerce has made in looking at the download. So for example, if you want to go to one particular program and you download that, it's going to give you a combination of years. It may give you 20, 21, 22, 23, 24. And so therefore, all of those have to be sorted in order for you to get a total, making it difficult to do for those that are not really as apt at working the Excel, and it doesn't really fully produce the quick results that we're looking for. So we added throughout this bill that you should be able to search by year. So currently, you're able to search by a program, by a recipient, and by a location, which means county, and also by year. So you'll find that throughout the bill. If you turn to page 4, if you look at lines 10 and 11, this is the summary part. It seems that it was unclear to the Department of Commerce that we were looking for totals. We wanted to be sure that we were requesting the right types of totals and that totals were included in the documents because on the website, because currently they are not. You have to do your own summations. And as I've already demonstrated or explained, it's not always easy to do. So if you look at line number 9, it says the summary report shall provide the total incentives awarded to the recipient, the number of years incentive may be claimed, the total unencumbered incentive award that may be claimed. Okay, that little second part there is important because, for example, if you have or are a recipient of an incentive, that incentive could last for 10 years. It could be transferable for 7 years, 16 years. And so there is an impact that's greater than what you might see for 1 year. And so we want to be sure we understand that commitment. Especially true for the bill that we're going to be working tomorrow. It also, just a little change, instead of on line 11, that total incentives that have been provided actually have been claimed. I think that's a little more clear. If you go down, it just describes that summary report. And I think the key portion of that summary report is not that we want another annual report that has a lot of narrative, but what we want is the 3 years of economic incentives claimed and the total amount of funds committed by the state or the local government that are required to be paid as an incentive over the entire period of the incentive. So we're just clarifying really what the summary is. It's really just totals by programs. And at the bottom, one of the comments that was made by a neutral conferee was that they wanted to ensure that it was going to be easy and manageable for local governments. If it was, then it was going to be not a big deal. And so we just made sure that it's in a format that's prescribed by the Secretary of Department of Commerce, but it is in a simple online format and shall only require submission of information in a digital form, which I think that's probably, could be assumed, but we threw out the assumption. If you look right below that on page 4, that's the technical cleanup. And let me reference, and actually our reviser, Reimer, he has already corrected it. And so, but just so you know what that technical correction would look like, if you go to page 2. Page 2 at the very top of the page under 6. So it's 1B6. There are a list of incentives for local entities. A through I, those would need to be included on the transparency database by 2026, so we're giving them an entire year. Just a note, I believe that has been added since November because I just saw it recently and I hadn't seen it prior, so I'm not sure when, but it's a new addition, so it's already there. And then item J, because that is more specific to local units of government and they're going to have their own unique incentives, we are giving them until 2028, which is very, again, generous amount of time for the department to organize a format that would work for those local units of government. The layering impact is very important. And finally, the last item is on page 6, and this one allows the secretary to impose a 1% administrative fee. And by the way, this is not an application fee. Those are completely different. This is an administrative fee for those that are recipients up to 1% and not to exceed $1,000. And that would provide the necessary dollars to maintain the website. I believe that Rachel told me there were approximately 260 or 290, some number in that upper 200s of recipients, let's say last year. We can't necessarily extrapolate that to every year, but if we say it's in the 200s, then we're talking about potentially up to $200,000 that could be used to maintain the website. And frankly, if the state of Kansas or our local units are providing incentive dollars, I do not think it is too much for them to ask that those dollars be transparently made available to the Kansas taxpayers, and thus they should fund that. I'll stand for questions, or actually I make my motion.
Seconded by Representative Wassinger. With a question, Representative Clayton.
Thank you. All right, I have several questions here. First, I kind of want to speak to process here. I've had some concerns where we will have a bill that is presented in a hearing one way. Then when we work the bill, there will be an amendment that changes things drastically where we have to make decisions on the fly, and we're not allowed to get a hearing from the stakeholders when it comes to that. So just not a fan of this process, but I'll continue with my questions. Are we allowed, and this might be more for the reviser, are we allowed to charge an administrative fee to recipients? Is that a thing that we can do, or will that necessitate additional changes?
The Department of Commerce had a bill that did change these fees last year that we never got to. And if this bill passes, they would be able to do it, yes.
Okay, so this bill would make that possible. All right, so the other question here is, what? Sorry. Okay, yeah, I wasn't sure.
I'll call on people, please.
Christ. Okay,
Go
anyway.
forward.
will this, whether this is for the carrier or whether this is for the reviser, will this cause additional costs for commerce or for the state? Because again, we're moving incredibly quickly through the budget process. I'm not on the appropriations team, but I am trying to make sure that we're being responsible financial stewards. And if we are blowing up the budget by passing legislation that heaps additional cost on our agencies, I don't feel like I'm responsibly budgeting by supporting these. So can I have some help here?
Representative Williams.
Yes, I would be glad to answer that. In terms of process, I would just say this is one of the smaller balloons that I have seen in many committees. I mean, so I would argue that it's actually a pretty simple balloon. In terms of blowing up the budget, well, I would say that when I requested through appropriations for the year 2022, how much we were spending on economic incentives, what I received back, whether it's accurate, I do not know, was close to 490 million. So for us to ask for a transparency website that is clear and functional, that it took 5 years to get us here, I do not think that that is too much to ask. In addition to that, I do not think it is too much to ask for up to 200,000, let's just say that's a lowball number, because it would completely be up to the Department of Commerce on whether they wanted to ask for it or not, to be used to make sure that those incentives are available and understood by the public, is a small percentage of almost $500 million.
All right, so when you do say it's not too much to ask, that means that it will increase the budget. Thank you.
I believe the 1% was to offset any increase in the budget. So, Representative Penn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the bringer of this balloon amendment because I think that it really gets after the concept of transparency for the people of Kansas to understand and the businesses of Kansas to understand what their government is doing in the vein of efficiency. I think it gets after that. And I think that it really does an admirable job of making sure that the legislative intent is put into the bill. I don't see that we're busting budget or anything to that nature, and I don't see it as a process anomaly or anything, kind of like, you know, bringing the Medicaid expansion amendment to the floor that hasn't been heard or worked or anything like that. So I thank the bringer of this amendment for bringing it through the correct process, allowing everyone to actually work it, discuss it, and I will be highly supportive of this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
On the amendment, Representative Osman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. A question for the reviser. On page 3 of the bill, there is one pullout. I'm having trouble parsing it to understand where it fits within where it's being inserted. It says, and location of the economic development project by county, calculate incentives total for each category, claimed by year and searchable by year. I don't understand how those two phrases fit together.
Reimer.
So if you look at the language there, and then you also look at the language at the top of page 4, you see the first box on the top of page 4. So really the language is, I mean, it's requiring the same thing. And it's, I guess, one could say redundant. I just put it in both places, both in the definition of what searchable website or web page is supposed to mean for purposes of the Department of Commerce, but also specifically requiring it, you know, in that, in the other language there on the top of page 4 that pertains to what the database is supposed to do. So in both cases, it's, you know, capable of calculating the incentives within each category by year and be searchable by year. So it's just a requirement, an additional requirement to current law that is for the database.
Thank you. Perhaps I should clarify. I understand what the amendment is trying to do. I just don't understand how it fits in to the previous section itself to make sense, because it appears as if it's a half of a phrase that goes in at the end of county. And I'm trying to understand how the entire phrase would work when put together.
Reviser Rimmer.
Yeah, that's a good point. I would have to add, just a comma there, or maybe and, just to tie it in to the list that you see there.
Okay, thank you. So I would, without commenting on the whole bill itself or the amendment itself, I might make the recommendation that we allow, when we pass the bill out, to have the reviser make any ancillary grammatical modifications that are necessary.
The bringer of the amendment, are you good with that? Okay. All right, any further discussion on the amendment? Seeing none. Reviser Reimer.
I just would request some clarification just as to the intent of the amendment. On page 6, with respect to the 1% administrative fee. As I was listening to the presentation by the bringer of the amendment, I believe that the intent was that local governments would also be required to provide an administrative fee to the secretary. If that is correct, then just for the committee's information, the language in the box there would need to be changed just to accommodate that.
Representative Williams.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. No, there was no intent for the local governments to either collect a fee. If they chose to do so, they could do so without us giving them the authority. They have local control on that. So I would not put any language whatsoever related to them either receiving or paying at this point.
All right, seeing no further. Willie Dove. Representative Dove, welcome to committee. Representative Williams, you may close.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So with this amendment, I do ask for technical changes to be given or to be allowable to make it clean and clear to the intent of the bill, and I close.
All right, committee, you've heard the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. All against say no. No. Motion passes. Is there any further discussion on this bill? All right, seeing none, with a motion to pass the bill, the second on that was Representative Wasinger, and with a motion to pass the bill as amended, Vice Chair Turk.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that House Bill 2304, as amended, be reported favorably out of this committee with recommendation for passage.
Seconded by Representative Williams, Christy Williams. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of the motion say aye. Aye. All against say no. Nope. Nope. Motion passes. All right, committee, that's all we're going to do for the day. We will be back here tomorrow. Moving forward, I would ask that we hold to decorum in this room. If we cannot, I will rearrange the seating to compensate. Thank you. We're adjourned.